They say when you talk, that you start with a joke, or if you're not funny, never start with a joke because it just gets awkward. So what I'm going to do is start with a story that President Herbert Hoover recounted in his memoirs about his last day as President of the United States, which was on March 4th, 1933. Now, President Hoover used to get his inner cabinet together, his friends, and he'd have this like 1 hour once a week where they weren't allowed to talk politics, they weren't allowed to do any business of the country, they just basically hung out and sort of chatted. Now, of course, Herbert Hoover is very dejected at the end of his presidency. The country's in the middle of a Great Depression, 25% unemployment, foreclosures up, people out of their businesses, their homes, their jobs, and it all started so well for him in 1928 when he came into office. So on his last day, his Secretary of State, Hyde, recounts this tale. He says, there were these two bankers. I'm going to tell you the story about them. One of these bankers is walking on the street, he's jobless, he's unshaven, he's tired, he's hungry, and he comes upon the circus manager at the circus, and he says, I just want a square meal. If there's anything you can do, I just want a little bit to eat. I'm dying here. And the circus manager says, I can't help you. I can't even feed my own employees. I had to kill the lion to feed the tigers. I got nothing. And at that moment, one of the employees comes up to the circus manager, and he says, the gorilla's dead. He's starved. He's gone. At which point, the circus manager throws up his hands in desperation and says, that's it, I'm finished. And the enterprising young banker jumps in front of him and he says, you know what, I got an idea. Let's skin the gorilla, I'll get in the gorilla suit, I'll get in the cage, and I'll perform for a square meal and a cut of the profits. So the circus manager says, okay, fine, I got nothing to lose. So the banker puts on the gorilla suit, he gets in the cage, he starts performing like a gorilla, and all of a sudden the lion in the cage next to him opens up the bars and makes for him ferociously, and the banker jumps back in absolute fear, and the lion says, shut up, you idiot, you think that you're the only banker out of a job? And this was something that Herbert Hoover remembered enough to recount in his memoirs. It's also in the book in case you want to learn it and tell it to your friends. When I was here, actually, a couple years ago, it was to talk about a novel I had written called Black Tuesday, which was the recount of a fictionalized, romanticized version of the crash of 1929. And really, by researching that book, I came upon the idea for this book, For All the President's Bankers, because there was a scene in that book that happened wherein 6 bankers, the big 6 bankers of the time, got together at noon on Thursday, October 24th, as the stock market is plummeting, and they gathered at the House of Morgan at the bequest of Thomas Lamont. He was a fellow who was the acting chairman of Morgan at the time, because Jack Morgan generally was never around, who was the actual chairman of Morgan. He was off traveling in Europe, as he tended to do, while everything was falling apart. And Tom Lamont got together 5 other bankers that represented banks across the city, and really that represented the most powerful bankers at the time, the 6 bankers as they were called. And in 20 minutes, they all decided to pony up $25 million to save the markets. The reason they wanted to save the markets was not because they care that people were out in the streets panicking, but they had money invested in these markets, and they wanted to figure out a way to prop them up long enough to have things settle out and to go forward and be fine. And after those 20 minutes, they come out. Reporters are all over the House of Morgan. 2 of the people from Morgan, Lamont and Richard Whitney, who later became the head of the New York Stock Exchange, go out the back door of Morgan, which downtown in Manhattan is literally, it's like basically from here to the back of this room to get to the New York Stock Exchange, the back door of the New York Stock Exchange. And he goes in, Richard Whitney starts buying up shares of U.S. Steel, which is one of the Morgan enterprises, and a number of other things, and this lifts the market. And it lifts the stories in the press, and the New York Times is all enthralling about how once again the Morgan Bank has saved the country, the world, Wall Street, the whole thing. Herbert Hoover in Washington breathes a sigh of relief. He thinks he's going to go for a second term. And then, of course, everything goes haywire. But when I looked at those big 6 bankers, something kind of clicked in my head, which is that we have a big 6 set of banks today. 6 is a common number in financial history. And those big 6 banks that were in that room in 1929 represented the Morgan Bank, which became today part of J.P. Morgan Chase, the Chase Bank, which is part of J.P. Morgan Chase, National City Bank, and First National Bank, both of which are now part of Citigroup, Bankers Trust, which at the time was a constellation of Morgan, and they still exist today. They're not one of the big six, but they survived. And the fact that there were 6 now and 6 then, there's different ones today. There's a couple more in there. Morgan Stanley is one of the big 6. They actually spun off of the Morgan Bank in 1934. And we also have Bank of America and Wells Fargo, but they sort of come in later. But the 6 banks that were in that room, 6 bankers that represented them, their legacies lived on. But going backward in time, they also lived before. In particular, the Morgan Bank, in particular J.P. Morgan, who had been the most powerful financier the country has ever known, and the most astute political financial power behind the presidency, who really created, in his time when he was running the Morgan Bank, a path that really informs what happens today between political and financial alliances. And it started in the panic in 1907. Actually, it started before the panic in 1907, but my book starts near the panic of 1907, in which there was a common occurrence going on. There had been speculation gone wrong, and as a result, a particular bank, it was called the Knickerbocker Trust Company, was going under. The reason it was going under was because depositors were freaking out because their money was in this bank, and it had been discovered that some of the leaders of this bank had made really bad bets in copper. They had tried to rig the copper market. So this idea of rigging markets, nothing new. Michael Lewis did the high frequency thing, but really the rigging of the markets has been something that has happened for more than a century, but this particular moment started an entire arc of historical events that really gets us to where we are today. Because Teddy Roosevelt, who was the president at the time, he was friends with J.P. Morgan. They were in the same social class. Their families hung out. They knew each other. They trusted each other. They had close personal connections. And Teddy Roosevelt, even though he came to power as this big trust buster and a progressive president and all of that, he never busted the banks. And on that day in October, it was in October again, in 1907, when the Knickerbocker Trust Company was falling apart, when there were people from Fifth Avenue to Harlem, the rich, the poor, were all trying to get their money out of this bank, and there was panic in the streets. There was policemen with clubs beating these people back. Things were going haywire, and Teddy Roosevelt was scared about his next presidency. He had not yet announced that he wasn't going to run, and no president wants to have an economy tank on their watch. So he says to J.P. Morgan, "You take care of it." And for the first time in U.S. history, he asked the Treasury Department to give money to a private banker to help to bail out the situation. And the Treasury Department announced they would give $25 million to Morgan for him to decide what to do with to save the situation. And in addition, because that wasn't enough, Morgan gathered some of his friends together. One of them was James Stillman, who was the head of National City Bank at the time. And the National City Bank and the Stillmans and the Morgans in general were very closely connected. Their families were very closely connected. And he also asked some other of his people, including Thomas Lamont, who I just mentioned was the chairman later in 1929, or the acting chairman of the Morgan Bank. So again, a tie that goes back for more than 2 decades. And these men sit in a room, and J.P. Morgan just says, "You're all going to put in some money, and we're going to find extra money, and we're going to save the situation here because we just can't have this continuing." He didn't put any of his own money in. In fact, he asked James Stillman to ask the Rockefellers, who ran Standard Oil Trust, if they could sell some shares so that they could get oil money so they could pay to have some of these banks saved. But he took the credit for it. And he also never saved the Knickerbocker Trust Company. He didn't have friends at the Knickerbocker Trust Company. There were no daughters married to sons working at the top of the Knickerbocker Trust Company. He decided to save the Trust Company of America. And by saving the Trust Company of America, in which he had personal ties, in which he had interest, in which his associates who were running other financial services around the city also had interest. And he was lauded as a king, literally a king, by the New York Times for saving the country. This was in 1907. He didn't use his own money. He opened the Treasury Department for the first time ever, and he got Teddy Roosevelt to never get in the way again of any of the banks. And the idea that banks could not be trust busted and that this political financial power could be used so behind the scenes in such a ultimately public fashion really started back then. And so what happened was, after he was lauded, J.P. Morgan decided, you know what, this cannot stand. We need to have another form of money making so that I don't have to get my friends together at night in my library or get money from the Treasury Department. All that part's actually okay. But we have a central bank, which became the Federal Reserve, which will back us. And the stories behind the start of the Federal Reserve have a lot of conspiracy stuff attached to them. But what I did is I actually went to Jekyll Island, which was the birthplace of the meeting that spawned the Federal Reserve in 1910. And I looked at a lot of the records there, which are not all open even yet. There's the Jekyll Island Club, which is a very elite club and was back then. You could only gain access to it if you were a member or if you were sponsored by a member, if you were the guest of a member. Today is a hotel resort. But they have a lot of the photos from back then, and there's roomfuls of old documents that are still being collected, and there's an archivist there who I worked with to look at some of the information. And what happened was, J.P. Morgan was not at the meeting, which we all know, or I'm telling you, but some of you have read it. But he sponsored the 6 people, again it was 6, that went to Jekyll Island to discuss the foundation of the Federal Reserve. And the reason that even happened was because he was afraid of the panic. And because once Teddy Roosevelt's administration was over and Taft came into power, Taft also was afraid there could be another panic. But there was another reason that the Federal Reserve was created that doesn't get discussed a lot in history books, and that is that America itself was at its crossroads of power. America was looking at the world and saying, we need a central bank to be more competitive with England, we need a central bank to be more competitive with France, and we need to have a unified currency, because at the time, banks were all issuing their own notes, and you could go and basically get notes backed by individual banks. And so if one bank failed, all of their notes failed, and it had a big negative effect on everything else. And so this idea was that if you had one consolidated place that issued Federal Reserve notes, issued currency as well, that would strengthen this idea and sort of unify this whole process. And that was something that J.P. Morgan was interested in. It was also something that President Taft was interested in, and it was something that a man named Senator Nelson Aldrich was interested in. He was the senior senator from Rhode Island, and he ran the Senate Finance Committee at the time, the Senate Banking Committee at the time. The Aldriches, were friends with the Morgans. They were friends with the Stillmans. In fact, for 2 years, from 1908 to 1910, after the panic, Nelson Aldrich hung out in Europe with James Stillman, who was one of the guys who was at that library meeting with Morgan. And he and James Stillman sort of travel around, talk to people, sent reams of paper back to Washington to show them what the plans were for the central banks and how to be like Europe, but not like Europe. How to be more in the interest of the private banks, but also be like Europe from the standpoint of creating a currency and being sort of globalized in the world. So in 1910, Nelson Aldrich hadn't, though, formalized a plan, and Taft really wanted to have one passed under his term. And so he went to Jekyll Island. But that wasn't also going to happen. What happened was Nelson Aldrich first came to New York. And in New York, when he was visiting his son, Winthrop Aldrich, who I will talk about as well later, but Winthrop Aldrich, who also is the great uncle of David Rockefeller, who's a name you guys know, and Nelson Rockefeller, who was a 4-time governor of New York and vice president of the United States, decades later. Nelson Aldrich goes to Winthrop Aldrich's house because he wants to discuss this matter, and he gets hit by a trolley car on Madison Avenue in New York. And convalescing in Aldrich's house, Morgan is like, you have to kind of continue this process. You have to do something. And Aldrich had wanted to go back to his estate in Rhode Island. He was a very rich man. But Morgan convinced him to go to Jekyll Island on his guest ship. So he basically said, I will open this place for you, take whoever you need and go. J.P. Morgan did not go, and that's kind of the thing about power. You don't have to be there, you just have to sort of maneuver behind the scenes. And what he did was he opened this island for them. And when I went down there, right now there's a causeway leading to this sort of area that's off of the coast and has all these dunes and stuff next to it. But at the time, the only way you could get in was through a yacht. And there was sort of people at the edge of the water, and the whole town was alerted that you couldn't even use their own boats to go anywhere near this island. And so there was an alert that went out. These people came, they got together. One of them was Frank Vanderlip, who was the vice president of National City Bank and a protege of James Stillman. So Stillman was represented, National City Bank was represented, but everybody else there was really represented from the Morgan Bank. And so that's kind of what happened. They came back. Nelson Aldrich was still sick because of the whole trolley car thing. And so he can't go back up to Washington. So who goes to Washington to present the plan they've just created? But Frank Vanderlip, from Citibank, National Citibank, and Henry Davidson, who became later one of the board members of the Federal Reserve. So those are the two guys that actually presented the plan that became the Federal Reserve. They also happened to be friends with Woodrow Wilson, who became president after Taft, and who ultimately signed the Federal Reserve Act in December 1913. There was a lot of sort of political back and forth going on between when Taft left and Wilson came in. Wilson campaigned against the bankers. He campaigned against this concentration of wealth in these money trusts. But he was friends with these people. Him and Frank Vanderlip used to hang out at Vanderlip's house in upstate New York and talk about events of the day when Woodrow Wilson was still president at Princeton University. Junius Morgan, who was the father of J.P. Morgan, used to donate money to Wilson when he was looking for money to run Princeton University. So the tie was pretty tight. So when he was talking against the money trust, he never actually mentioned any of them by name, but he did get elected on being a populist president, and he did sign the Federal Reserve Act, and he also took the country into World War I. The person that was by his side in terms of helping to finance World War I was Jack Morgan, the son of J.P. Morgan. After a year of being in office, a year and a bit, as war was starting to break out in Europe, Woodrow Wilson called Jack Morgan to the White House. And again, the press was all abuzz about this. There were reporters there were flashes. They were like, why is Jack Morgan at the White House? We thought that, the country thought that he and Wilson are sort of on different pages. And after this meeting, which was at noon, in the middle of the summer 1914, Jack Morgan comes out. Jack Morgan's a really private guy. So he doesn't talk to the press. In fact, he just tells the press, talk to Wilson. I'm leaving. Woodrow Wilson then gets asked by the press, why was Morgan here? And all Woodrow Wilson says is, he was here at my pleasure. And what it turned out was, through World War I, the Morgan Bank financed 75% of all war-related financings. And this wasn't, I didn't know that. I found out that number from this little report that went to Woodrow Wilson in one of his letters. It was a large percentage, and it wasn't so much that he was doing it separate from the White House, and that's a lot of the point in my book, is that these alliances aren't something that the bankers are imposing on the presidents. There's a mutually reinforcing collaboration that allows both of them to maintain powers in their separate orbits between politics and finance, but they really do work together. And back in the earlier part of the 20th century, they hung out together. They went to school together. They were engaged in social activities together. They liked each other. They trusted each other. They ran things together. One was elected, and one wasn't. And that's also where some of the democracy starts to break down, because we elect the president, we don't elect these bankers, and yet the influence tends to be pretty equal. And so that really eats away at what we have as a democracy, whether or not they make good decisions together or bad decisions together, whether or not it helps the population or in many cases hurts the population. But for World War I, the Treasury Department and Wilson were all on board with having Morgan take care of financing. He instructed other banks where they would place funds. He was working with increasing the level of war bonds that were sold through individuals to help finance the war. He was involved in a lot, as were his partners at National City Bank and at Chase, but mostly orchestrated by the Morgan Bank. And this was one of the reasons why the Morgan Bank was so influential in World War I and also into World War II. Now, back to Tom Lamont. He went with Wilson after the war to help negotiate the Treaty of Versailles. He's not a name that comes up in talking about the Treaty of Versailles, which was basically how reparations after the war would be paid to the Allied countries from the aggression countries, as they were called. And Lamont he left his job for months. Wilson was on the road. He was the first sitting president to ever travel overseas, to ever be out of U.S. soil, and he was there for quite some time because he really wanted to get this right. And Lamont was working on the financial side, so he was kind of there in two capacities. One was helping Wilson, one was negotiating with England and France because they wanted more reparations and Germany wanted to pay less, and all sorts of other things were going on. And the other was just traipsing around Europe trying to assess the situation from an economic standpoint for opportunities, as well as to help people. So he was kind of doing both things. And when they came back to the United States after the treaty was signed, Woodrow Wilson pressed for something called the League of Nations, which was to be mirrored like the United Nations ultimately became, and which would have all these countries agree that they would work together and have sort of a lasting formalized peace. Well, that didn't get passed by Congress. They didn't like that idea at the time. They mostly wanted to retread back from having to deal with anything internationally and become very much more isolated from the standpoint of politics, of trade, economics, everything. In fact, Frank Vanderlip, who I mentioned before is one of the guys who had presented the Federal Reserve Plan in Washington, he had become disillusioned with Wilson in general, and he was actually campaigning against the League of Nations because he was annoyed that Wilson took Lamont instead of him to Europe. So there was other kinds of little skirmishes that were going on behind the scenes. Lamont, while Woodrow Wilson was stricken with, he was a very unhealthy man, particularly in the later part of his presidency. He had a lot of headaches, he had a lot of sicknesses, he also underwent a number of strokes. And while he was trying to go around the country in weakened conditions, and his doctor was like, you can't do this, you have to stop, you have to come back, you have to rest, Lamont was actually taking up the slack to push for this League of Nations. And here's a guy who's a banker. And he's on Wilson's side. Now, on the one hand, he and Wilson developed this really tight, close, personal, almost just very emotional relationship. The letters back and forth are really quite, some of them are touching. There's a lot of verbiage and stuff. But he also wanted the League of Nations because banks, in order to expand, need to have places into which to expand. And in general, at the time, when there were problems in countries, that meant you had less trading partners. And if you had less trading partners, you had less places where you could expand your financing. And so from the standpoint of money and of the banking community, they wanted the League of Nations, and Lamont really championed the League of Nations, even though politically they didn't want that because the country wanted to stay isolated. In the end, the League of Nations was shot down. In the end, I'm going to fast forward to World War II. That had tremendous problems along with how the Treaty of Versailles was negotiated that manifested in World War II. In between those two times was the great crash of 1929 and the Depression at which Hoover was talking about, the joke about the two bankers with his Secretary of State Hyde. And during the time between World War I and the crash in 1929, there was tremendous speculation again. Everybody forgot the lessons of the panic of 1907. We now had a Fed to back banks, and there was a lot of shadiness going on, particularly because of international plays that the bankers thought they could now do. So trading into Latin, or giving loans into Latin America, looking at sugar constellations in Latin America and so forth, where they could really get speculators to invest and sort of turn that into profit for the bankers. And a lot of that stuff was based on faulty numbers and speculation, and nobody looking in Washington as to what the bankers were doing. Because at the time, the regulations didn't exist. And from World War I through to 1929, there were three separate presidents who did nothing or didn't care to do anything to stop the sort of party of speculation of the stock market bubble. It was after the war. This was the time to do it. America was about America. The bankers were about America, supposedly. And none of the presidents, from Harding to Coolidge to Hoover, wanted to do anything to stop the party. They also had a very common Treasury Secretary named Andrew Mellon, who happened to have been a millionaire and happened to have left in disgrace in 1932 before Hoover left because he was doing some shady things with tax evasion. This is a Treasury Secretary. So that was the period during which the bubble of the crash in 1929 happened. And when it crashed, when the market crashed and it fell on the faces of the general population, that's when FDR came in. When FDR came in, he wanted to do something, obviously, to stabilize the country economically, but also to stabilize the banking system. Now, he was also friends with the Morgans. In fact, his father, James Roosevelt, and J.P. Morgan, back in the early 1900s, had created a club called the Metropolitan Club, which still exists in New York City, where all this sort of political and financial important people of the country would get together and discuss matters of the country. So again, the two families were pretty interlocked going back to the beginning of the century. And when it came time, though, to separate banks and to remove speculation from the depositors' money, from the citizens' money, and stabilize the country, FDR actually went up against the Morgans. Even though he was friends with them, he actually went against them because they didn't want a separation of speculation and deposits because they didn't have a lot of deposits. That's not the kind of bank they were. They did big things with big companies and big countries. They didn't want to have any sort of separation of being able to issue debt into countries and to have any sort of speculative power to decide which countries they were going to issue debt into. And so they were very against this. And 3 successive, very senior people at Morgan wrote many letters, talked to, went to the White House, advised FDR not to split up the banks. But Winthrop Aldrich, the man who Nelson Aldrich was convalescing at, his son, back in 1910, was now head of Chase. And he saw things differently. He decided that actually it would be better to have the banks separated. And a little known story, I didn't know this until I went through the material, and I've sort of been talking about it in my talks and in the book, is that Winthrop Aldrich worked with Roosevelt to create Glass-Steagall Act, to separate the speculative activities from the depositors, because he thought that it would be better for the country if people had confidence in the banks. In fact, Roosevelt felt it would be better for the country, not just domestically, but also, on the sort of emerging superpower stage, if things were solid at home. And so Winthrop Aldrich took out an article, a front page spread in the New York Times to advocate the separation of banks into speculative and commercial or deposit-oriented functions before the act was even passed. And in the first 8 days that FDR was in office, Aldrich and the new head of National City Bank, James Perkins, who replaced the old head, Charles Mitchell, that's a whole other story, who was very, very shady in tax evasion and just sort of a precursor to Sandy Weill of Citigroup. Those 2 guys knew Roosevelt very well, and they actually promoted his efforts, and he, in return, helped stabilize their banks. Now, they also had personal motives, which is that they wanted to compete against the Morgan Bank, which had done all this war financing in which they had been competing with for years. They wanted to sort of be supreme to the Morgan Bank. So that was an ulterior motive. But they could also sort of straddle this idea of the public being more secure, as well as they being more powerful and having this alliance with the president because it made sense to them. So at the time, things were going really on both fronts. And through World War II, the Chase Bank became more involved in financing as a result. So again, there was another business motive for that, as did National City Bank, because the head of National City Bank had supported FDR. He turned to them for support in return. And as a result, National City Bank started to become its own preeminent bank in the Big Six, because it was the primary bank that issued war bonds, and that its head went around the country with the Treasury Secretary, with Morgenthau, who was the Treasury Secretary of FDR, to gather funds from individuals by promoting the idea of war bonds in return for also opening accounts with National City Bank. So it was a good way to basically raise money for the war, as well as to increase their deposit base. So, again, they had ulterior motives. And as a result, after the war, National City Bank started growing in importance. And it was also because of a personal alliance between the head of National City Bank and the FDR administration. By the time Truman came in, fast forward through the 40s, through the 60s, but between Truman and Eisenhower, there was similar alliances with sort of new people. Except Winthrop Aldrich was still there. He was the UK ambassador for Eisenhower. He was one of the bankers that got Eisenhower to run for office. At the time, after the war, Eisenhower was considering whether he should vote Republican, be Democrat, not run at all. And it was really a series of bankers who just made him be Republican and just wanted him to be president. And in return, during his administration, he helped them expand globally. So after World War II and during the Cold War, his doctrine was such that the United States politically and militarily now would back countries around the world that were leaning capitalists, and they would fight against countries or protect countries from other countries that were communist. And that was the whole sort of crux of the military aspect of the Cold War, but the financial aspect of the Cold War was really aligned on the same side, because Chase and National City Bank and all the guys that were running them wanted to expand themselves. And so they worked with Eisenhower to set up branches and outposts in regions throughout the world where they thought they could have a stronghold militarily and from a new open trade perspective, and they could open up branches. One of them was Cuba. In 1955, National City Bank opened 3 branches in Cuba. Chase opened a couple. There was this idea that Cuba could be the open branch office to the rest of Latin America, which was in the sights of these banks in terms of a place to make money from. And in 1959, Fidel Castro, when he became head of Cuba, kicked them all out and nationalized it. So they also had gone before that to Beirut, where they thought that they could also open branches there, and that would give them an outpost to the Middle East. And as they were opening these branches in the 50s, American military power, Eisenhower, was behind them. On a personal basis, they were all really good friends. Eisenhower was just a master letter writer. I spent a lot of time in Abilene, Kansas, where no one spends time. It's a very small little town in the middle. And I was there in August, so it was really hot and silent. It was me and this other guy in the archives who was studying sort of cattle raising or something, because Eisenhower had been involved in. But it was the amount of correspondence between Eisenhower, and of course he had been at Columbia, but he didn't really grow up as a banker. He just forged these really tight relationships immediately with everyone who was anyone out of the Big Six banking community. And they, in turn, just had this very lovely correspondence where Eisenhower allowed them to grow domestically as well, and many mergers took place in finance in the 50s. And he also backed them internationally, and they backed him. And the letters that he wrote, I mean, he used to go up and like every night just write tons. He would dictate, there was no spell check or word, there was just dictation of just mounds and mounds of correspondence trying to figure out what should be done and how things should go and all sorts of things like that. And he asked a lot from these bankers who were not necessarily in his cabinet, who were not even appointed. He had bankers in his cabinet as well, but just to help him with economic strategy. And some of them really pushed it in their behalf. And there was this one guy, George Whitney, who was the brother of Richard Whitney, who was the guy who had bought all the stocks on the New York Stock Exchange back in the 20s, and who had subsequently gone to jail for other fraud. But his brother had been a partner at Morgan for decades, and he actually had this really tight relationship with Eisenhower. They played golf together, and Eisenhower played golf with a lot of bankers, but in particular, they were good golf friends. And he said to him, for example, when Eisenhower was looking at tax policies for the United States, whether they should reduce taxes for corporations or reduce them for individuals, and George Whitney fervently pushed Eisenhower not to reduce taxes on corporations at the expense of individuals, because he, even though he was a banker, said, I think that money in the pockets of the citizens actually means more to the overall economy than it does with these companies. They're doing okay. And I mention that not necessarily to glorify George Whitney, but to say that there was this period in our history which is very, very different from where we've gotten to now, where these alliances were tight, the personal, the political, financial, and all of that, but there was something in them that was actually beneficial, or could sort of at least envision, though not perfectly, the fact that if you had a stronger economy from the ground up, that might be better for everyone, as opposed to being completely self-serving and sociopathic, which is what it is. So, but what happened was, between the 60s and the 70s, is that sort of idea started to break down. When JFK came into office, for the short time that he was there, he had relationships with bankers. In fact, he and David Rockefeller, who was coming to the forefront of the Chase Bank at this point, he had been in the bank for a couple decades and was slated to become its chairman. Again, the great nephew of Winthrop Aldrich, who had been the chairman of Chase and connected to Nelson Aldrich, with John McCloy, another fellow in between, who was a sort of protege of the Rockefeller family. He wanted the country to continue to sort of do what it was doing under Eisenhower, which was to back more financial expansion into these countries, to back more private interests into these countries. And JFK kind of didn't want to do that. He believed that allowing Latin America to be safe on its own and to be economically stable on its own was actually better for America. And that to have too much private investment and to turn it into sort of international hands was negative for America and negative for Latin America. And so on those two things, they didn't see eye to eye. And that was kind of where a little break started to happen between these alliances of, you do this for me, I do this for you, and we'll both get power and we'll both sort of at least do something for the country as well. Though David Rockefeller then started to get very public about his disagreements with JFK. And in this article in Life magazine in 1962, he actually wrote against JFK. It was the first time a sort of private citizen, a banker, had written against JFK and against his policies. And that sort of started a rift. But JFK learned quickly, and he decided to get the bankers back on board, and he started to give them concessions up through the time where he was assassinated. 4 days after that, David Rockefeller writes a letter to LBJ, the new president, where he doesn't miss a beat. He starts talking about what LBJ can do in terms of his Latin American policy, and LBJ decides that his policy will be about private interests in Latin America, and it's not just David Rockefeller, it's Walter Wriston, who's now a fellow who's rising to the head of National City Bank, and those two banks are now doing a lot of opening into that country and that area, and sort of disregarding what they can do nationally and what they can do in America, because all of a sudden expansion internationally seems much, much, much more profitable. And so they're back on track with LBJ. But LBJ did something that his next presidents didn't do, which is he demanded stuff. He said to David Rockefeller, you know what, I'll open this for you. I'll be on your side on your policy, but you got to back me. And I have this great society idea, and I have progressive ideals, and you have to back me because that's the only way I'm going to back you. And that was how LBJ worked. But he did do it, and he did negative things as well, but he did do it in such a way that there was a give and take. By the time Nixon came around, and Nixon took the country off the gold standard because bankers wanted this idea of having less assets behind money, because that meant more free investment, because if you don't have to hold something against your transactions, then you can do more of them, you can bet more if you have less to lose. Then everything started going in opposite directions. The bankers found that in addition to not having this restriction, they found oil in the Middle East and recycling. And I don't know if you guys read my Seattle Times op-ed this morning? Wow. So the point was that recycling these petrodollars, or the profits that were now coming out of their branches and their newly forged relationships in the Middle East, they had extra money from the outside too. So because they had extra money that they could recycle into debt in the third world and so forth, they didn't have to be they had less accountability even to being aligned on a sort of positive public basis with the presidency. And then things started going haywire from there. So between the years afterwards, they pushed for more deregulation of their banking internationally as well as domestically, and they started getting bailed out for their mistakes in epic ways. So the third world debt crisis that happened in the 1980s under Reagan and under the first Bush was a direct result of that disalignment in those policies and those sort of self-interested policies that enabled them to take more bets at the expense of the government, at the expense of the American people. And the third world debt crisis was an example where the government did rally substantially to help them bail their bets out. That was followed in the 90s under Clinton by the 1994 Mexican peso crisis, by the Asian crisis, by a series of crises where in different ways the government stood in to bail out these bankers, and the relationships were not as close and personal as they had been over the many decades in the beginning of the century. They became just more functional. So there was still the fact that Ronald Reagan took as his Treasury Secretary Donald Regan, who was the CEO of Merrill Lynch. So the first Treasury Secretary from what is now part of a Wall Street Big Six banks that was a Treasury Secretary for a president, was chosen by Reagan. But he was also friends, Reagan was, with George Bush. And George Bush, as his Treasury Secretary, took Nicholas Brady, also a senior person on Wall Street and a friend of the family. The Bradys and the Bushes had gone back for decades and decades. And the Bushes, from 1900, under George Walker, one of the sort of patriarchal Bushes, had a bank that became part of Merrill Lynch, which has become part of Bank of America. So again, this is like a 100-year connection that ultimately got to a position in Washington where deregulation started happening in the 80s under Bush's task force, which Reagan asked Bush to create. Reagan didn't really get involved in sort of details, but Bush did for him, with these men who pushed deregulation in Congress. And the reason they did it now was not about American superiority, it was about American competitiveness. And they said that if America had to compete in today's globe, the politicians, the treasury secretaries from these banks, as well as the bankers on their sides, wanted to make sure that they had no impediments, that they were as unregulated as possible, and that they had as much money to use as possible if things went wrong. And kind of that's where we wound up from here in 1999 under Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin, who was a former co-CEO of Goldman Sachs in the Clinton administration, who helped Clinton get elected, and the sort of new set of families that have now become more preeminent along with the old Bushes in Washington. There was more deregulation. The Glass-Steagall Act was repealed in 1999, and that created this avalanche of speculation it ultimately came down on everybody in 2008. I was here in, I think, 2009 when I talked about It Takes a Pillage and sort of looked at how the banks had done so much bad betting after the 1999 repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act because they had merged so substantially, and everybody was fine with that from the Treasury Secretary up through the Federal Reserve, that they backed these policies. And the result ultimately was the subprime crisis of 2008 and the bailouts that have been epic, and the fact that the Federal Reserve today, which had started as a bank to the banks, a bank to the bankers, bank to the banks, now for the big six banks has done substantially more support in the form of an epic amount of subsidies, which equate to $4.2 trillion of securities buying, treasury securities and mortgage securities from these banks, which are sitting on the books of the Fed. That has just been unprecedented in history, that the required reserves that the Fed wants to supposedly make banks secure and have money in the back pocket in case something goes wrong is $86 billion. The banks have reserved $2.5 trillion as part of that whole Federal Reserve book. That's doing nothing to help anybody. So while you're getting 0% interest on your savings accounts, they've got $2.5 trillion of money parked at the Fed getting 0.25%, which isn't a lot, but is still more than what you're getting, on the bonds that they have parked at the Federal Reserve doing nothing. And meanwhile, the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, after Ben Bernanke, is talking about how they're a job creation mechanism, when that's really not what they were ever created to do. They were created to support the banking system. That is really what they've done. And the trillions of dollars on their books is just indicative of where we've gotten to because of these political financial alliances and this philosophical alliance as well as to American competitiveness and what is needed. And strong banks make a strong country as opposed to strong people make a strong country. And strong foundation of economics for everybody is a stronger way to be. We have this sort of top-heavy situation where the banks are just getting a tremendous amount of subsidies, not passing it on. And worse than that, the concentration of that wealth today, the concentration of the risk that is behind that wealth, because all the times in our past when we've had low interest rates, when we've allowed the kind of betting, when we've backed the betting, there's always been a worse financial crisis afterwards. That's just been what history has said. And if there's no accountability at the top of these institutions, then there's nothing to counter that danger and that possibility of a bigger crisis happening again. And that's really where we are. I close the book with the statement that we have to break these alliances or they will break us, because first of all, I'm taking a little bit of that off of Justice Louis Brandeis, who wrote that in 1910, who said we have to break the money trusts or they will break us. He was a very sort of visionary guy, and I copied the name of his book, which was called Other People's Money, was my first book. But nothing was really learned in the 100 years. In fact, again, we have more consolidated wealth, we have more consolidated power, and we have less accountability. There isn't even the sort of gentleman's nobility of, you do this for me, I do this for you, and there's some notion of what can be done for the greater common good, or at least the appearance of a public interest element being a part of it. There's nothing like that. It really is a very selfish, very dangerous situation for us that exists today. So I do say we have to break the alliances or they will break us, and what I mean is, it's hard to see why after 2008, well, I know why, but it's hard to understand the logic of post-2008 crisis that we still have made the big banks bigger, and that we've created more subsidies and more bailouts than we had before, and that no one in Washington seems to think, absent a couple senators, seems to think this is a problem. Certainly not at the level of Obama, certainly not at the leadership level, certainly not in the Treasury Department, where Jack Lew was working with Robert Rubin back during the Clinton administration when Glass-Steagall Act was repealed. There's just no leadership coming to even say, this could be a problem. There's this willingness to believe, absent personal relationships, absent accountability, that somehow the banks are better and somehow the economy is better, when in fact it isn't. And they're not. They're just subsidized very, very well. And so I believe that if we don't do something, and if we don't at least start to take power to ourselves, and I'll try to end positive. I always end negative, and people are like, you always end negative. But what I want to say is, and what I said in the op-ed, and the editor who made me do this, is that it's important to figure out how we can take some power back and create our own alliances. And some of it sounds a little pie in the sky, but I've thought about it a lot, and I've gotten this idea from the 30s to the 60s, where again everything wasn't perfect, but at least there was some notion of a little bit of public interest creeping into the political financial policy discussions, that we have to take some of this stuff back. And the only way to do that is not necessarily to go and, we're not going to have the meeting with Obama. We're not going to, I would think none of us who are actually here in this room will do that. But we are together, and we can do things like support anything local and anything community and anything credit union-like, and buying books from third place books, and whatever it is that starts to establish these alliances at the bottom up. Because honestly, if you go back 100 years, yes, there was a lot of money and power in these alliances, but what made them so strong in terms of impacting the country was that they existed, was that they worked together, was that they tied themselves together. And I think what happens a lot when you think of the amount of just lack of leadership and sort of economic danger and strife that's in the country, that what can we possibly do? But we can sort of learn from this idea of creating alliances with each other, with our local finance companies, with our credit unions, and as I've mentioned, with our communities, with our people at work, with our families, spreading knowledge and doing things together in a way that actually binds us better. Because I think, and as it happened in the 30s, a change in this country is going to come from two places. It's going to come from a massive crisis or many crises that will continue to impact the country, or it's going to come from the bottom up, and it's going to come from our awareness and our connections to each other, and our not going home and doing nothing, and our not being isolated, because isolationism was and is what hurts the country, whereas working together and supporting and creating alliances actually helps the country and helps individuals, helps us feel more empowered as well. So I'm going to end on that note and open it up to questions. Thank you.
For how long? It's been months and months and months. The Federal Reserve has been buying back, 80 billion a month, approximately, about half mortgage back and the other half derivatives?
Treasuries, yeah.
Is it derivatives?
It's treasuries, but it's debt.
So mortgage-backed securities, it's buying, are these toxic? Is it paying 100% on the dollar? So it's making the banks hold for all of this. Is this why the foreclosure rate kind of is going slow, because they can't foreclose? They have to wait for the Federal Reserve to bail them out?
That's an excellent question, and it is absolutely true that we don't have transparency to know exactly what securities they are buying, but they are definitely buying mortgage securities from the largest banks, which were the ones that were most involved in the toxic securities creation just by their sheer size and how active they were in that market. It's my belief a lot of those securities are toxic. Ben Bernanke, when he became the chairman of the Fed, suggested this would be the most transparent Fed ever. But they were not transparent. But yes, this is definitely the case. And they are paying 100% on the dollar for all of the securities that they're getting, and that is providing the capital. And it's also providing the room on the balance sheets of these books of the banks to be able to engage in more activities, because they basically have cleaned house at 100 cents on the dollar. So yes, that's absolutely been the policy. And the reason foreclosures...
Inflating the banks.
They're inflating the banks at our expense, and the reason foreclosures have sort of slowed down but not stopped is because what should have been done is the Fed sort of subsidized the loans that make up these securities rather than the securities, which is what they are doing. And that would have actually stabilized the crisis much more. And when people say, I'm going to ask a question to your question, but when people say, could it have been different? Did we have to bail out the banks? Like, no, we didn't. We could have actually bailed out the borrowers, because there's no particular reason that a borrower who's in trouble can't get as much help as a bank, or a bank's getting much more help in the financial crisis in which the banks have really pushed the engineering of these loans and the creation of these toxic assets. So yes, we are subsidizing more.
Taxpayers going to have to bail them off in the final analysis when these toxic things don't produce the money?
We are in this position now where they're throwing so much subsidies at the banks that they've been keeping them stable while they're letting banks clean house. If and when that goes away, and if and when there's another, say, large derivative trade, it might not be subprime, it could be in oil, it could be in a particular country, it could be in a group of, it could be in a region, it could be in Asia. But what happens is that crises happen generally when something happens because of a bad credit bet. It was copper in 1907, but it's mostly been on credit in countries, subprime, Brazil, whatever it might be. So That, I believe, can still happen, and we are still on the hook, and we will still have to bail them out, because even though there's been plans in the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 to say that banks have to create these living wills, so supposedly we won't bail them out. If you actually read the living wills, it just basically says that they're going to try to sell their assets, and if that doesn't work, they're going to try to sell themselves, and if that doesn't work, they're going to come to the FDIC and ask for the FDIC to sort it out. Well, if a lot of banks do that, or even one major bank does that for one major large convoluted transaction, that really starts to collapse the whole system again, which is why I say it's ridiculous that we have these banks as big as they are. And it's not even just a question of money and power concentration, it's a danger concentration.
I read a lot about the dot-com crash, and it seemed to me that repeal of Glass-Steagall has a lot to do with that, although it didn't happen until very long before the crash. Is it accurate, though, that the repeal played into the crash?
Yeah, and any time, and there was a weakening of regulations even before that final repeal. It had been happening throughout the 80s and even a little bit in the late 70s. And the thing is, and like I mentioned before about gold or about low interest rates or cheap money, whenever there's just an abundance of money with no accountability, bad bets happen. You know, part of it's the regulatory environment, part of it's human nature, part of it's the idea that, you keep on hitting the whatever number on the roulette table or another hand of blackjack or whatever it is. And particularly when money's cheap to come by, you do that more. So the deregulation enhanced all of that. The 1999 Glass-Steagall Act enhanced all of that. But also it was happening into the dot-com crisis in the 90s, which makes you wonder why the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed right after that. But again, it's this sense of sort of omnipresent philosophical alignment between the leaders in Washington and the leaders on Wall Street that says that all we need to do is continue to compete globally and to have as little restrictions to do that, and you just have another crisis.
You were speaking of forming alliances, and one bright spot is Elizabeth Warren, and I was wondering if there are others out there that I should be aware of, that we should be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, and also one other person, which some of you may be aware, is Ellen Brown, who's running the Public Banking Institute, and who's also running for, you're not in that state, the Treasury and the State Treasury in California. She and her alliances, her people, are very much involved in this idea of the public banking initiative is sort of like the local banking or credit union initiative, but on a sort of broader basis, which is that if you have a bank that's really just doing banking activities that are plain vanilla, taking deposits, making loans, checking accounts, a couple of credit cards, nothing crazy, but they're not betting with it on trillions of dollars of derivatives in the market or subprime mortgage packages, it's more stable for everyone involved. And so that initiative is really important. Elizabeth Warren, of course, has been advocating for Glass-Steagall reform and everything else. Senator Bernie Sanders is someone who's on that page as well. So there are people, and Elizabeth Warren's doing well. I mean, her book's out all over, and it's a book. And I'll say one other thing about alliances. I was talking about everybody getting together. What I found very recently, and really recently, like since my book came out, which has been 2 weeks, that we authors who are writing about this stuff, who haven't really necessarily all met each other, are starting to talk to each other. And that's kind of interesting. There was one man, for example, Harvey Kay, he's an author who's just written a book called The Fight for the Four Freedoms, which talks about some of the initiatives that FDR placed in the 30s and so forth. I didn't know him, but we sort of aligned during the process of our books. James Rickards, who writes about the death of money, and his other books, I don't know him either, but we've become Twitter friends. So these alliances they're there, so it might be next door to you, and it might be Elizabeth Warren's blog or Twitter account, but it can be there.
Hi, so I'm very pleased to have been here. You had a very good discussion on the whole process leading up to where we are today. However, I just wanted to bring up, I disagree with you on one thing, and that is my sense of the general urgency of the situation. I mean, obviously the finances since 2008 have been, a clown show. The Dodd-Frank bill, which has been pasted over as a new Glass-Steagall reform, has in Title II the bail-in perspective, which is a very different thing than separation of the banks. It's the essentially stealing of the depositors' they call them the unsecured investors in the bank.
It's part of that living will thing I was talking about, yeah.
Okay, sure. But, I mean, it's funny that you mentioned well, I mean, first of all, it seems like a bail-in now that could precipitate by any number of bank failures, and these guys go for a stealing of people's deposits, could precipitate any number of catastrophic meltdown phases. I mean, runs on banks, you name it. But, I mean, one thing, too, just thinking about the whole situation that we're seeing with Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and Russia, it's funny you brought up this thing about World War I and the bankers. I mean, this thing could trigger who knows could be World War. Anyways, the question I had for you was, given that, I mean, it seems like that what people should be called on to do is to really mobilize from the highest level to get Glass-Steagall through, not just at the local level, but, you know, national and to
Yeah,
stop
no,
it.
I mean, when I say the local level, I'm talking about alliances, but one of the solutions is definitely to bring back Glass-Steagall, and I mean, I end sort of all my books, I've been ending all my books with that, except for the novel. But I agree, you know, and I mentioned a crisis to I think it was no, it wasn't you, it was, I don't know where you went, but a crisis could happen in any manner, and I mentioned it could be Latin America, it could be something to do with credit, but something to do with the Ukraine and what's going on there. There's, you know, President Obama spent some time with a bunch of bankers trying to tell them in advance what the policy might be with respect to Russia and the Ukraine. You know, exactly why I don't know. Those records won't be available for decades, if they are ever available, but the point was to somehow get them to, I guess, whether it's to dial back their bets or to not take positions or see what they were positioned in or whatever it might be, because something catastrophically bad could happen on an economic standpoint, on a financial standpoint to them. And so that's something that, yes, that's definitely a potential problem militarily, as well as therefore financially, because, you know, a lot of times those two things do together. So it is an urgency. I mean, the fact that we are subsidizing the current structure of these institutions and these alliances don't ask for accountability, the political from the financial, like even they've done in the past, is a very bad situation. So there's things we can do and there's things we can demand, and there is there's a very real possibility. That's why I didn't want to end on a negative note, but there's a very real possibility of a very bad financial crisis because nothing has been done to reform the institutions that would be at the center of it. And Dodd-Frank, yes, Dodd-Frank is a sham in that regard, and it isn't the Glass-Steagall Act, and it doesn't really do anything. It just has a lot more pages. So.